Hello everyone, my name's Tak, and today I'm going to be showing you how to recreate this scene here. If you're familiar with platformers, then you've probably already seen something like this, especially if you're a fan of the Mario franchise. So what we have here is a switchboard that, when you stand on buttons, starts moving in the direction the arrows are pointing in. During the process, you will learn about Decentralized ECS utils library, which has some useful pre-built components. You'll also learn about game objects, when we separate the code for the switchboard, which not only keeps the main part of your code tidy, but makes it easier to add more switchboards later on. Other than that, hopefully you'll pick up a few more useful tricks along the way, so let's get started. If you head on over to this repo here, then I've got the project files ready for you to start this tutorial. So all you have to do is clone this project by copying this link here, or alternatively just download the zip file and zip that if you want. I'm going to assume that you've got the CLI already installed, but if not, you can follow the instructions down here in the readme. But I've already got it installed, so I'm just going to clone this directory, clone this repo. So head on to your terminal, git clone, paste the link. Once that's done, change the directory to the cloned directory and open that up in your editor. I'm using VS Code, which is the recommended editor for developing in Decentraland. So let's look at the assets for this project. So I'm going to open these models up and have a look at those first. So I like to look at these GLB files in sandbox.babylonjs.com, where you can just drag and drop these files and take a look at them. So this is the base, which is the ground plane for our scene, and next we have the buttons. Looks like that failed to load because we're missing the textures, so let's just drop those in. And here's one of the buttons for the switchboard, another. Gears that go on the side of the switchboard, and these start rotating as the platform moves. Next we have the platform, which is a static object, so these are the rails, and we've got a ramp here, the coin at the end of the rail for the player to collect, and finally we've got the switchboard, which looks like we've got some Z viting here, or C viting. That's caused by the collider actually, so you could just hide that and take a look at the switchboard. It's worth noting that what you see in the sandbox isn't going to be exactly what you see in preview. And that's it for models. So let's look at the sounds. We have a couple of sound files, coin pickup and the switch. So now that we're familiar with the assets for this project, it looks like we're ready to code. Before we do, let's run our scene first. So open up the terminal, and if you're not familiar with VS Code, you could go into View, Terminal, and then in Terminal type in the command dcl start. Run that. That will install the dependencies for you and automatically load the scene in the browser. As you can see, we're dealing with a single parcel layout, but we actually want two for this scene, so let's do that next. To do that, you go into the scene.json file, and in parcels you add the coordinates here, so this would be 1 in x and 0 in y. I would recommend naming your scene as well, and I'm going to call mine switchboard platforms. Save that. And let's take another look at our scene. So that's updated our parcel layout now, and we're ready to start adding the models to our scene. Which are here. So let's start by adding the base. And if you remember, that's the ground plane. New GLTF sheet. GLB. And next we'll add the transform component. And don't forget to add it to the engine so you can see it. Save that. This is a bit annoying. So if you get this message pop up, just close it or ignore it. So as you can see, our base, our ground plane's too small, so we want to scale that up, and it looks like we need to scale that up by 2 in the x-axis. So let's go back and set that here. Takes in the factor 3, 2 for x, and the others could remain the same. The other axes could remain the same. So next, let's add the platforms. So I'm pretty much repeating what I have above. New entity, platforms. But we're going to be adding the platforms instead. Actually, for the platforms, we don't need the transform component because I've already modeled the platforms in place. You only really need the transform component if you're planning to position, rotate or scale the model later on. So let's add that straight to the engine. Save that. That's been added. This ramp already has a collider with it. We don't have the colliders for the rails, as we'll be using the switchboard to be getting across. So let's go back to our code and add the switchboard next. I'm going to give it a position just so that we can see it in our scene. Save that and let's have a look. Okay, so the switchboard has been added. Currently it's missing the buttons, and you may be wondering why this is glowing. And that will become more apparent later on once we add the buttons. So let's add the buttons next. Button A. For these buttons, I'm going to be adding the transform components as well, because they're going to be moving up and down as the player walks on and off the button. The other thing is these buttons have been modeled in place relative to the switchboard, so I'm going to be setting the switchboard as the parent. Let's save that, have a look. There we go, we have the first button in place. Let's add the other. Oh, when you have an entity with a parent that's already added to the engine, then you don't have to explicitly do so like what I'm doing here. I'm just going to duplicate the code for the button and do a find and replace. So I'm just going to replace button A with button B. Save that, let's have a look. There we go. The only thing we're missing now is the gears, so let's do that quickly. So I'm going to do the same thing, but instead of button A, it's button B, and change that to gears. Let's save that and have a look again. There we go. Okay, that's all our assets in place now. So next we're going to look at separating the switchboard into its own class. For such a simple scene, it's probably not necessary, but I imagine the scenes you'll be creating will be a lot more complicated, and generally it's a good idea to separate your code into reusable chunks. So if you decide to add more switchboards later on, you can do so more easily. To find out more information about what we're doing next, head over to Decentraland Docs under SDK Advanced Game Objects. You can read all about it here, but I'm going to be showing you how to do that now. I'm going to start off by repositioning our switchboard so that it's actually on the rails, and I've already figured out the positions for you, and the starting position is moving the switchboard up in the y-axis by 3 meters. The end position is 27 meters in the x-axis. So there you go. It's worth remembering these positions for when we come to create our switchboard class. I'm going to undo all that. Do that our starting position. So to create our switchboard class, we come into the source directory, create new file. I'm going to name it switchboard.ts, and in here I'm going to export class switchboard. I'm going to call it switchboard, which inherits from entity. We're exporting because we want other files to have access to this, and we're going to need a constructor, which gets called once as soon as you create the switchboard, and then we're going to do a call to super, which gives us access to this keyword. So within the constructor, let's add some parameters. So we're going to need the model, the starting position, which is factor 3, the end position, which is an factor 3 as well. Then we're going to need the buttons, so button A, which is an entity, button B, which is also an entity, and finally the gears, which is another entity. This looks kind of complicated what we have now, but as you'll see, all we're really doing is transferring the information we have here over to the switchboard class. So let's add that to the engine, this, and then let's add the model, and then add a transform. So I'm going to position the switchboard at its starting position as soon as you create the switchboard. So save that, and let's head back over to the game TS file and change the entity to switchboard, the switchboard class we just created. And you'll notice as soon as we do that, VS Code will automatically import that class for us. If it didn't do that, then you're going to have to include this line here. Let's hover over our switchboard to remind us of the parameters. So the first one's the model, which is a GLTF shape. Just cut that, paste it here. and this is the starting position, and if you remember, we have the end position as well, which is 27 in the X direction, and finally we want to include the buttons and the gears. Save that. I'm going to quickly reformat that after I delete this. Reformat. As you can see, we're getting some errors here, and the reason why that is because we're trying to access the variable button A before we even declared it. So a quick fix is just to move all that up here. So that's why we're getting errors for all these down here. But now we're getting the same error for switchboard, because we're trying to access it before we even declared it. So we could just move that back again. But I'm going to transfer this all over to the switchboard class instead, just so it's a little bit neater. Save that. Let's do that now. Add it here, button A, set parent to this. Do the same for B and for gears. Now that's done, we can return back to our scene. Let's refresh it and see if it's actually updated properly. Okay, so you shouldn't see any difference, because all we've really done is transfer the information we had down here over to the switchboard class, and then instantiated or created the switchboard using that class. We're now ready to install the ECS utils library from Decentraland, so let's do that through the terminal again. I'm going to press Ctrl+C to kill the preview, and to install the library you have to run npm install Decentraland ECS utils. And once that's done, head over to our switchboard class and import the utils library. So heading over to the repo, there's a lot of useful tools here that we could make use of, but the ones that we're interested in are this move transform component and this keep rotating component, as well as the trigger, which I think is down here. So let's look at that now. We want to add the trigger components to our buttons, so that when a player walks into the trigger, it pushes down the button and moves the platform. But to begin with, let's just add the trigger. To do that, it's utils trigger component. If you hover over the trigger component, you can see there are a lot of parameters here, and a lot of these we don't need actually. The first one, we specify the trigger shape, which could be a sphere or a box, but after that I think it's the next four. They're to do with trigger layers, but we're not going to worry about that. But we are going to worry about the on camera enter, which is when the avatar enters the trigger. The next two, probably don't have to worry about the exit, but this enable debug is actually really useful for visualizing the trigger box shape. So let's add the trigger box shape now, and that takes two vectors, one to specify the size and the other is the position. So I'm going to make it 2 by 2 by 2, and then for its position I'm just going to set it to 0, There is a shorthand way of doing this, which is vector 3.0, but I know we're going to be moving this later, so that's why I'm doing it like this. So once that's done, we're missing the next parameters, which are to do with the trigger layers, which we're ignoring by entering null. And then for camera enter, we're going to create a function. Let's tidy this up. There's an error here. Looks like I'm missing a bracket there. Okay, got an extra bracket there. I'm going to format this quickly. Okay, so here's our function. I'm just going to tidy it up more. Here's a function for when the player enters the trigger. I'm just going to say button A triggered. And then for exit, I'm going to say no. But for debug, I'm going to say true. So we can actually see the box in our scene. Let's load our scene again. Let's have a look at that. So as you can see, our trigger box shape is out of position here, and it probably isn't even triggering when you walk over it. So let's open up our browser console. To do that in Chrome, you click on these three buttons here, go to More Tools, then Developer Tools. So yeah, so we're not getting any logs here. So let's go back and move our trigger. From memory, this is 1.5 in X and 2 in Y. So we just moved the box for the trigger, and this should be working now. So every time I'm walking into it, you can see we're logging button A triggered. Next, we want to move the button down when it gets triggered. So to do that, we get the transform component, gets position in Y, and move that down by 0.12. That will push the button down so that it starts revealing the glowing planes, if you remember from earlier. That will give the impression that these buttons are glowing. So let's try that now. As you can see, that's working. We don't need our debugger anymore, so let's delete those two things, save it again, and try again. Okay. Let's refresh actually. There you go. So right now, when the button is pressed, it remains pressed, but we want it to push back up when you press the other button. So this is button A. When you press button A, button B pushes up, and when you press button B, button A pushes up. Let's go back and do that now. So button B, set that to 0 in Y, and let's just duplicate what we have here. So change that to button B. This needs to be negative 1.5 now. And let's change the log. Button A's position. Button B needs to be negative 0.12. Let's save that and have another look. Okay, looks like it's working really well right now. So next we want to move the platform. And to do that, we're going to use the move transform component of the utils library. So that'll be this dot add component new utils dot move transform component, and if you hover over it, you'll see that we need the starting position, the end position, and duration, which is in seconds. There is a callback function here. but that's optional. So you can see whenever you see a question mark on a parameter, that means it's optional. So the start position being its current position, so get component transform dot position, and we want this to move to the end position. Let's put in 3 seconds for now. Copy the same thing again, and let's do the same thing for button B, but instead of the end position we're going to the start position instead. So let's save that and go back to our scene. Okay, we're getting an error here that says that component of type move transform component is already present. This happens because we're trying to add this utils move transform component when it's already been added before. So instead of doing add component, we do add component or replace instead. That'll fix the issue with that. Okay, looks like it's working. You may notice there is an issue with this in that when you try to travel a short distance, it's still going to take 3 seconds, and we want that to work proportionally. So if it's traveling 10 meters, you want it to travel, let's say, 10 seconds, and if it's traveling 3 meters, it will do that in 3 seconds. So let's look at that now. Okay, before we do that though, whenever you see yourself repeating code, it's usually a good sign that you could refactor that into a function. So I'm going to do that now by right clicking, refactor, press enter. I'm going to call this method move transform. Don't need this log anymore. And it looks like we're passing the entity through here. Instead of doing that, we might as well pass the entity directly from the constructor. So let's set those to public. And if you're not familiar with this, all I'm really doing is setting up a variable here called entity, and if it wasn't public, I'm doing this dot button A equals button A, and that needs to be down here. But what I'm doing now is just the shorthand way of doing it. So instead of these button entities, we want their positions instead, because these are going to be changing depending on which button you're pressing. So I'm going to set these to button A position, button B position. I'm going to change this parameter name to target position instead, just so that it's less confusing. And just remember above, we've added public to our entity parameters. So now we're doing this dot button A, and then getting the transform, and then saying its position, which should come from these arguments here. So okay, we've got a type issue. These are going to be numbers and not entities. So let's sort that out now. Save that. And okay, so button A's position will be negative 0.12, and button B Y position will be 0. And we could do the same thing down here and replace all this. And instead of the end position, we've got the start position, and these need to be switched around. So this is 0, and this is negative 0.12. And that should fix that. So it looks like everything's still working, and we're still having that issue with the travel speed. So let's look at that now. I'm just going to tidy this up quickly with an intermediate variable here. So let current position equal to this dot transform dot position. So now we can place that in there instead. So right now, no matter what distance the platform is travelling, it's still going to take 3 seconds. And the easiest way to fix that is to take the target position and subtract the current position. And we're only interested in the X direction for that. You may have noticed an issue with this actually, because we may end up with a negative number. So for instance, if we go back to our game file, you can see if we start at 8 and then we subtract 27, we're going to end up with a negative number. And to prevent that, we can make use of the math library with that absolute number. So now if we get a negative number, it will return the number without its negative sign. I think we're missing a bracket there, a parenthesis. Let's save that. Let's double check that. Okay, it looks like it's working now, but it's going really slowly, but at least it's going at a constant speed now. So right now let's make changes to this. Let's say we want to only take a portion of this, which we can do by multiplying by, let's say, 0.25. That should go in there. So right now, what took 10 seconds before will now take a quarter of the time, so 2.5 seconds. So I'm only taking a percentage of what we had before. Save that. Okay, just have to refresh. Okay, that speed looks okay. That's good. So next we need to look at these gears and make sure they rotate as the platform moves. And to do this, we're going to be using the keep rotating component from the utils library, which we'll add to the gears here. So I'm going to do add component or replace utils dot keep rotating component, and that takes in a quaternion, and I'm going to convert that to an Euler so that's easier to work with. That way we just specify the X, Y and Z direction. Having worked with this before, I know that we're rotating in the Z axis, so that being 180 degrees. So every second is rotating negative 180 degrees. So it will take a full second, 2 seconds for it to rotate 360 degrees, do a full turn. Let's do the same for our button B, and this time we rotate it the other way. Let's save that and see what we've got. So that's working. Those cogs are spinning. We've got an issue here, and that's with the gears and the buttons. They probably should reset once it reaches its destination, so let's do that next. So down here, if you remember, there was a callback function hovering over the move transform component. There's a callback function for when the platform reaches its destination, so let's add that here. I'm going to tidy this up quickly, and when it reaches its destination you want the buttons to reset, so set those back to 0, and you want the gears to stop rotating. Actually, we could probably move these down here because we're repeating ourselves again, so let's do that now. So instead of gears, we say this.gears, and instead of the 180, let's put a parameter in there. So this would be, it's called a rotate speed, and that'll be a number. Rotate speed, replace this 180 with rotate speed. Now we can just get rid of that, and we're missing a parameter here. So for button A, that's negative 180 degrees, and for button B, that's 180 degrees. Okay, looks like we're ready. Oh, missing one more thing, which is just to stop the cogs from rotating, which is which you could do by specifying 0 there, but actually if we get the component, the keep rotating component, it actually comes with a stop function, and I could use that instead, and that looks a bit neater. Let's save that and have another look. Okay, looks like it's working so far. So once we reach the end, the button resets and the cog stops spinning. Great. The last thing we want to add is the sound. That's the sound for the switches. So every time you walk on the button, it plays the switch sound. I'm going to add that up here. And I would recommend everybody add sound to their scenes, even if it's simple, because it really does add to the immersiveness. So I'm going to create a switch sound here, which is a new entity. Add components, and we need an audio source, which takes in an audio clip where we specify the MP3. This switch.mp3. We also need to add a transform mode, and that's one thing to note, is that sound, where the sound plays is important, but there's a trick to playing the sound wherever the player is standing, and I'm going to show you that now. And that's when you get the transform component, grab its position and set that to the camera's position, like so. And don't forget to add it to the engine. And to actually play the sound, we have to run it. Let's add it here. So get the audio source and play once. And that will play the MP3 here, and we probably want it down here as well when we reset the switches. So let's test that out. Okay, it's looking, sounding pretty good. Once we reach the end, it resets. Brilliant. Okay, I think that's it for now. And there is one final thing that we need to add, and that's the coin that's floating in the air for the player to collect. But I'm going to leave that as an exercise for you to do by yourself, as the concepts are going to be pretty similar to what we've done here already. So you need the sound for the coin pickup, and also you need to apply a trigger to the star coin model. Okay, and that pretty much wraps things up for now. And if you have any questions, then please post them up on the Discord channel. If you head over to Decentraland's website, there's the join our Discord channel link here. Other than that, I think that's it. Happy coding, and I look forward to seeing everyone in the upcoming game jam. Thank you. Bye bye.